We are continuing in a series that we are calling Learning to Walk in the Dark, Walking in the Dark, and what are some of those lessons that we can learn from that? We have people throughout this congregation who are reading a book by Barbara Brown Taylor that goes by that same title. And it's an opportunity for us to understand both literally what's it mean to embrace the dark, but also she's dealing with it in the dimensions of depth in terms of spiritually, what does darkness represent in our lives. One of the things we need to acknowledge and just be real clear about is that as humans, all of us have unique experiences and unique challenges. My experiences and my challenges are different than yours. Yours are different than mine. They're different from everyone's. The thing is that if we are going to grow and develop, if we are going to mature and learn, if we are going to become more compassionate, more empathetic, we need to be a people who hear about other people's experiences, other people's stories. We need to hear other voices besides our own. You know, I think stereotypes can be troublesome on a number of different levels. Sometimes they're just simply not true. But often when it comes to stereotypes, we like easy answers. We like a narrative that fits with our story. We like a narrative that doesn't make us uncomfortable. We like something that gives us handles that are easy to grab onto. And one of the problems with stereotypes is sometimes they fulfill that function. They give us a story that is comfortable for us. But one of the problems with stereotypes is besides sometimes they're not true, is they often take something and reduce either a person or a group of people down to a single story. And as we know, all of us are unique. And a single story never accounts for any of us, or much less a group of people. And so if we want to be those people who are developing, maturing, who are becoming more wise, we want to be a people who are growing in our empathy and our compassion, we have to be open to other people's stories. And the very first step in that is breaking out of that echo chamber of our own experience. It's real easy for me as a white male to just assume that my story is the right story. And when I think of everybody through my lens, I miss the richness and the deepness and the wisdom that comes through others' stories. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we break out of that tendency to see everything through our own lens. Or just someone who's like us, looks like us, thinks like us, those people that we know and value. And what we need to do is we need to open ourselves up to other voices, other experiences, other stories, especially those persons who've been marginalized. Think about LGBTQ people, or people of color, or women, or people who are experiencing a different ableness than us. They have a unique perspective. They have a unique story that can help us grow in our understanding of this world. But why marginalized voices? I think there's a number of reasons. One is because those are voices that have historically been silenced and discounted. Those are the stories and the voices that to this day continue they're voices that today continue to be ignored. Often those persons are ones that are being marginalized on institutional levels. And one of our challenges is can we be a people that are committed to growing and developing and listening to others? The disciples that Pastor Kelly read about this morning found themselves in just such a situation where they were coming out of a context where they were focused on their story, and they were put in a place where they were open to hearing someone else's story, and it was pivotal for them in their own development. Let me give you a little context about Matthew's Gospel. One of the things we need to understand is the editors and the authors of the Gospels that we read they came out of a context and they had a perspective that they were trying to share. For example, John's Gospel. What John desperately wanted us to understand is that Jesus was the Son of God. He wanted us to understand the divine nature of Jesus. And so John's Gospel put a special emphasis on helping us understand the divinity of Jesus. Where Luke had a different agenda. Luke wanted us to understand that Jesus had a special love for Gentiles. That Jesus had a special love for those who are the marginalized, the least, those who get left out. And so Luke told the story of Jesus' life in a way that would help Gentile communities, non-Jewish communities, understand who Jesus was and what his mission and purpose was. Interesting enough, the story that we read from today came from Matthew's Gospel. Here's what Matthew wanted his readers to understand, is that Jesus was the answer to the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for. Matthew wanted the Jewish audience to understand that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was the Savior. And so his stories had a special focus on Jews. And that context, that community. And in the passage that Pastor Kelly read for us this morning, we have Jesus leading his disciples, we're told, to this region that was off the beaten path for them. It was a region that was along the Mediterranean coast, and it was a prominent area was Tyre and Sidon. And Tyre and Sidon were communities that were occupied by what Jesus' disciples would have considered foreigners, as outsiders, as people who were not a part of the Jewish tradition that they were a part of. I suspect that it was an uncomfortable place for them to be and to minister. And it was in this context that we have a foreigner. She's described as a Canaanite woman who came to Jesus, and she came to Jesus because her daughter was not well, and she wanted Jesus to heal her daughter. And we're told by Matthew that initially what Jesus does is he just ignores her. Doesn't respond to her at all, but the disciples are really irritated. In fact, they're like, we need to get this woman away from us. She is bothering us. She's irritating us. But this woman, she persists. And she comes up to Jesus and asks him to heal her daughter. And Jesus' first response is, you know what? I've come for the children of Israel. That's my mission. That's who I am here to care for. And she then pleads, Jesus, please heal my daughter. And then Jesus uses the statement that is just so problematic. He said, it isn't right to give food that's intended for the children to the dogs. And then she continues to persist. She says, but even the dogs are able to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus then affirms her for her faith. I will confess that I probably went about the first 8 years of my ministry and I would not preach on this text. I found it just so problematic and I just didn't even know how to deal with it. But the more I've read this text, it still makes me incredibly uncomfortable. But the more I've read it, the more I've lived with it, the more I've studied, I think I have some handles that are important. The first thing is, it's interesting to see how the church has dealt with this text over the years. There's been primarily 3 different ways that the church has dealt with it. The first was to say that this was not an authentic text, that this just was inauthentic, that there were some conservative Jewish Christian authors who wanted to make sure that the church did not lose its focus on the Jewish Christian community, that inserted this story in there. And then later editors ended up, if you will, just kind of revising it and cleaning it up, trying to make it better than it was. And that they said, it was never actually something that Jesus ever said. Others have said, no, Jesus said this, but here's what you need to understand. That the word that's translated as dogs actually reflected household pets or puppies. And if you could have seen the glint in Jesus' eye and heard the lilt of his voice and the way that he said it, you would have known that it was said in love, that it was said in a very disarming way, and it was a metaphor that nobody would have been offended by. So what do they try to do? Pretty it up, right? Try to find ways to make it acceptable. Others say, you know what this really does? This is to help us understand the nature of Jesus' Jewishness. That he was human, fully human, just like we are. That he also needed to go through some development and growth on the understanding of his call and his mission. And whereas it was accurate that his first field of ministry was the Jewish community, that this was this time when his ministry was expanded to also include Gentiles, non-Jews. You know, all three of those explanations, we don't know what the true story is. I don't feel particularly comfortable with any of those explanations. The thing that I do feel really strongly about is that this woman gives us a powerful witness about what does it mean to have one's own agency, one's own sense of self, and what is a faithful response when we face adversity. And the thing about this woman is she was one of those, part of a marginalized community. It deals at least on three different levels. One is that she was a foreigner. She was a foreigner who Jews would have looked at as outsiders. The second thing was her gender. Once again, you remember we are dealing in this first century culture that was very patriarchal. And so right away there's the fact of her gender would have made her a marginalized voice within this community. The third thing is why was she going to Jesus in the first place? It's because she was looking for a healing of her daughter. And it was said that her daughter was possessed by demons. And that would have automatically made her not only an outcast, but also a sinner. Because this community had this, what Barbara Brown Taylor, the author that we're reading, had this understanding of this full solar spirituality that would have said, you know what? If her daughter was sick, that must have been a curse from God, and the only reason God would have cursed her is because she's a sinner. And so do you see the levels how the disciples would have heard her story? And yet, this woman, we are told by Jesus, is a model of faith. Why do you think that is? Let me give you three suggestions. She has this interaction with Jesus that does, in my opinion, not go well in terms of how this interaction takes place. You know, Jesus says, you know what, I've come for the children of Israel. She says, yes, but you can help me. Jesus says it's not right to give food that is intended for the children to the dogs. And she says, but yes, even the children or even the dogs receive the bread or the crumbs that fall from the table. The very first thing is that she is confronted with this language that appears to be extremely insulting. How does she respond? She doesn't respond by lashing out back at him, doesn't she? She doesn't break into some kind of racial or ethnic slur and go into this fight mode, does she? Rather, what does she do? She acknowledges that she and her daughter are precious children of God that are deserving of this healing. Another alternative is, instead of just going into this full-out response of fighting, is she could have just froze and just tried to disappear. But no. Once again, she had her own sense of self, her own agency, and she claimed for herself and her daughter that the belief that the God of Jesus, that the God of Israel, that the one who she's approached, this Lord, this Son of David, is one who can bring the healing power of God to her family. And so she doesn't fight, she doesn't just freeze and try to disappear, and she also doesn't run away, but rather she stands up for herself, finds her voice, and makes her request. part of what we need to understand as people of God, as people who are trying to walk in the way of Jesus, as people who, like the disciples, can be so tempted to see the world just through the lens that is our own and that is most comfortable to us, is that there are marginalized persons and communities that have so much to teach us. Barbara Brown Taylor says that part of what it means for us to grow is to be a people who are willing to listen to other voices and grow in our understanding of our faith and our world and our place in it by listening to those voices. One of the things I love about this woman is there was about 50 members of our church that studied a book called Reckless Love early this fall. And one of the things we were challenged in that book was to always begin with love. Begin with love in our assumptions, begin with love in our conversations, and begin with love in our actions. Do you see how this foreigner, do you see how this person who came from a very different world and a very different set of experiences than the disciples demonstrated the great commandment to love God and to love people by how she began with love? She began with love in her assumptions about Jesus. She began with love in the way she communicated with Jesus. And she began with love in her actions. Those of us who are seeking to honor God and seeking to be a blessing to the world, we are living in a world where it is so polarized and where we are so reluctant to hear other people's stories. We're living in a world where we just go to that place that'll give us the story that we want to hear. And yet Jesus says that part of what we need to be about is listening to other voices. My hope for us is that we are going to be a community that listens deeply to one another and those other voices in the world that have been traditionally marginalized. That in that listening, we are going to grow in our own understanding about what does it mean to be the person that Jesus calls us to be. What does it mean to be a disciple? May we be a people that have our own sense of agency. That we understand that we and everyone else was created in God's image, was fearfully and wonderfully made, and is of sacred worth and dignity. May we be the kind of people that don't respond to slander or violence with this kind of fight mode where we just right away engage on that level. But rather, let us claim the good news of God's love and the way of Jesus as the way that brings life and truth and new life to all.